revivalist, strong puritanical movement. And I've indicated to you in Ghana how that puritanical movement actually located itself, established itself in Ghana as such. And one can repeat that, one can look at the unique way in which these puritanical groups have established themselves in different parts of Africa as well. But here I want to talk about what happens when one of the major effects of one of the major targets of their discourses. And they target particularly African, what they consider to be African traditional practices or African Islamic practices that they claim are not really part of true Islam. They're not really part of the Islam of the original Islamic traditions as such. Because many of them often are inspired by having studied for some time overseas, particularly in Arab countries. They come back and they find their own local traditions of Islam quite strange, alien, and they want to purify them, they want to change them completely. Now shrines are, they target the shrines for change and for sometimes for destruction, as we have unfortunately seen in Mali as well in the last couple of months as well. But I think that what I would like to point out is that if one looks at the shrines as part of a Muslim public, when one starts looking at the discourses that are going on in any particular country or any particular site, then you get a much more complex complex development taking place. Now I'm not saying therefore there isn't a destruction, like I said what happened in Mali, but there's often extreme contention about this issue, but also other kinds of forces or other kinds of discourses that impact on this Muslim discourse. So I want to talk about the Cape Town tradition because I've done my own research in Cape Town around some of these sites that have become contentious issues since 1994. But what I would like to share with you is that in addition to the kind of religious debate that is going on the shrine, one should also take note of the fact that shrines have also been the subject of nationalist discourse as well. So in South Africa, immediately after 1994, over the next period of time, South African government tried to redefine its national spaces, its national sphere. What are the most important sites? So the African National Congress went around identifying the major points or major spaces of struggle against apartheid, against colonialism, and it tried to somehow memorialize these sites as such. But it went further than that. It also included some of the other sites of smaller religious communities, like the minority religious community in South Africa. And so these shrines provide an ideal opportunity to say, well, these were also sites of struggle against the Dutch company rule, and then later Dutch colonial, or at least British colonial rule as such. So the shrines on the one from the state were actually seen as heritage sites. This is the heritage of South Africa, modern South Africa for the last 350 years or 400 years as such. On the other hand, there is an intense debate among Muslim groups, some people suggesting, no, these are our original contributions, these are our forefathers, and others saying these have nothing to do with Islam. And then you have new groups of people, Muslims coming from other parts of Africa, or some people coming from Asia, identifying these sites, looking at these sites as part of a global geography of Muslims and shrines as such. So the Muslim public that you see in Cape Town, on the radio stations or in the media, is an amalgamation of these kind of different sites. To the extent that when I looked at this and also looked at the debates and discussions among scholars about what are Muslim publics, I thought that it's very difficult to actually say whether the Muslim publics are really, in favor of democracy or they are in favor of puritanism. But what you find is any one of these publics actually, any one of these publics reveals parallel discussions going on at the same time. And it's very difficult to actually identify one from the other. Parallel publics are probably parallel discourses. Sometimes they sort of get into each other. So on the Muslim radio station, somebody will say, no, but these are our heritage sites, we should do that. When I visited the shrines and waiting for people to come there and to find out what they are there for, I found people who were coming from India, who had adopted the site. I found people who had been just told by their teachers that these are their forefathers, but they really didn't know anything about them. So the idea of the shrines were open to appropriation from so many different kinds of, from so many different angles as such. Okay, so my final particular site that and then I try to come to some kind of conclusion, is quite important. might have thought in terms of the time I should skip that, but perhaps I will talk about it. This is a site that also of a student, a PhD student of mine from Kenya. They did a study of public preaching in Western Kenya of both Muslims and Christians. So, as we were looking at these Muslim publics in different parts of Africa, we realized that by focusing attention only on Muslims, we were perhaps missing a large part of it. The Muslim publics in Africa, particularly Africa south of the Sahara, was often engaged with religions, sometimes like often Christianity, that were almost running parallel to them, but they were very close to them as such. I suggested to you with the Kenya writing of the constitution, but generally the study of Islam, I think in the academy focuses very much on Islam only, and then you have the study of Christianity as well. But it's very, very difficult to put the two together, and I think this is one of those attempts that we undertook. And I think that in the period going forward as such, I think we're going to try to be doing that much more often, because it suggests some interesting possibilities to think about Muslim publics as well. Not to only see them as Muslim sites, but also to look at parallel, at least to look at religious groups working together. So Joseph Wandera looked at public preaching in Western Kenya of both Muslims and Christians. He also related it to the liberalization of the public sphere. From the 1990s onwards, Kenya became much more liberal. Permission was granted for public preachers to go out into the gardens of Kenya, to go into the public parks, to the markets, and to start preaching. So they would simply go there, ask people to come together, invite people, through all kinds of advertising media, and people would come there, and then there would be either a public preaching, and sometimes there would actually be a debate as such. They often had to get permission, but permission was easily granted. This is not always the case in East Africa because of the potential for conflict that comes out of this public preaching, particularly in Tanzania. But Kenya seems to be a place where there was, at least where this particular practice had increased since the 1990s. What did he actually find? What is interesting is that the different ways in which Muslim preachers and Christian preachers approach public preaching. Both of them occupy the same place. They would organize among themselves. I mean, they had to get permission to preach, for example, in mumias near the market. They often chose the market. But Muslim preachers and Christian preachers were, in fact, from very different backgrounds and actually approached preaching very differently. But they spoke in a way to their particular situation in Kenya. So let me start with the Muslim preachers. What is very interesting is that not almost, but all the Muslim preachers that Joseph Wandera interviewed, and he interviewed them on their biographies, found that they were actually previously Christians. So they had converted to Islam in one way or another. It speaks to the fact that Muslims and Christians are very close to each other, so many of their families had some Muslims in their families, or at least some distant relations as such. But eventually they became Muslims. But not being trained in the religious sciences in Islam, not being trained as Muslim teachers or imams as such, they basically use the Muslim preaching as a way, basically, the focus of their preaching, Islamic preaching, was actually the Bible. They quoted very little from the Quran, but they basically discussed most of their, in their preaching was actually an analysis of the Bible. And obviously, as Muslims, they were using the Bible, giving it a very innovative hermeneutical tradition of actually saying that in order for Christians to be really true Christians, then they have to become Muslims on the basis of the Bible as well. So I don't, there's not time to actually go through the detail, but they basically did obviously a selective reading of the Bible, but in a way that they were much more familiar with the Bible and sharing what they themselves did, for example, in order for the Christians. Underlying this, with the Muslim preachers were a kind of a very combative, trying to persuade others to convince them to become Muslims, and also to convince them about the truth of Islam, about the fact that true Christians should become Muslims. On the other hand, Christian preachers were occupying often the very same places as such. First of all, they would organize the preaching not as a kind of a debate or a discussion, but they would cordon off the preaching site as a church. And their discussions on their preaching was much more directed at the economic conditions of the Kenyans. They were asking people to join, asking often other Christians from different denominations to join them. These were Pentecostal Christian groups as such, who were mainly engaged in public preaching. And they would often claim, or at least promise, that the miracles of God and the miracles of Jesus would actually help the people from their particular predicament as such. So the upshot of these two different kinds of approaches to preaching, the one is of Muslims, very combative, very debating arguments against Christians as such, reveal to a certain extent the kind of minority context in which they locate themselves, the perception among Muslims that they are marginalized within Kenya. They don't have the highest positions within Kenya as well. On the other hand, the Christian Pentecostal preachers were trying to change, and were trying to envelop the public space into a religious sphere, promising religious salvation in the context of the economic or political crises in the country. Okay, so what I've done now is perhaps a bit of a quick tour. You made me feel like sitting on a red open-top bus in Cape Town. I hope that they have a lot of questions. But what I would like to do now is having a look at these different Muslim publics. Remember, looking at these different kinds of enunciations of Islam. It's perhaps very difficult to say that one can actually summarize that into this is African Islam or this is Islam in Africa. Perhaps a lot of people try to do that, but I think it's much more complex to do that. But I think that when one looks at the Muslim publics in Africa, so it seems to me that one can begin to draw some kind of conclusions. My one suggestion is that it is the Muslim publics as such certainly means that Islamic discourse is open and unhinged. It is an open discourse. It has been, there's no single particular, there is a kind of a tendency in one particular direction and in various contexts as such. But I think that there's possibilities are very much clear within the kind of Muslim discourses that are taking place. Sometimes, even when you don't necessarily see it from the outside, when you take a closer look, the experience is it's a highly debated, highly conflictual, highly contested terrain continuously that is taking place among Muslims. I've spoken about the Muslim discourses among Muslims, and I've alluded a little bit to the discourses participated, at least the kind of parallel discourses when you begin to speak about Christians participating as well. I haven't focused on the way the state, or maybe how the discourse would change, or how the discourse would look like when you begin to include maybe Western voices in this Muslim discourses as well. But certainly the point that I can make is that it is a highly contested debate, an open debate, conflictual debate, even though you can clearly see some kind of directions as such. I think the second thing to be noted is that the political conditions are probably crucial. In almost all of the cases that we looked at, 1992 or the 1990s, the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, certainly set the process for the emergence of these Muslim publics. That even though the governments don't all immediately change, or they do not necessarily change overnight with a democratic constitution, but this kind of intention, the political atmosphere, or the intentions that were generated opened up the spaces for people participating. And sometimes you would have people setting up an Islamic party, for example, in that particular context. Others, you would have somebody setting up a radio station, or maybe somebody setting up a new religious movement as such. So the political conditions are quite crucial for the proliferation of Muslim publics. And I think then follows technology. I wanted to, generally when one looks at the literature on Muslim publics or Islam in public life, it seems to me that a lot of the discussions, in particular I would refer to people who have made significant contribution to our standing on Muslim publics, they often say it's the technology that leads. I think certainly within the context of studying closely Muslim publics, I think it's not so much the technology that leads. The technology does contribute, but certainly it's the political context that actually leads, and then technology is adopted very quickly in these different spheres as such. When one looks at Muslim publics in terms of the values that are generated, or the values that are promoted, certainly I think that it is beyond politics. Certainly I think it's not always democratic politics, I think there's, first of all, let me say that there's a real possibility, and we've seen it in a number of cases, especially in countries, in certain countries where you have the states actually falling apart or at least disintegrating, then you have radical Islamic politics coming out of the discourse as well, Muslim discourses as well. But even when you look at the Muslim debates themselves, there's much more going on in politics. Politics is probably not the most important signal. So the Habermasian or the Casanova, I think this is, or maybe we need to still see that in the future, but the idea of a new kind of politics emerging from Muslim publics, I think in the 1990s or later has been a bit premature. I think there's much more going on there than politics. In fact, politics probably is a much more lesser importance in the Muslim publics. What is more interesting is that what being debated in the Muslim publics is actually religious values or religious traditions. Religion is a center of the debate, center of the discussion. In fact, many of our research projects, we started off by expecting much more deliberations on values, on social values, on political values, but what we found is much more deliberation on religious values and religious practices as such. And it has forced us to actually go back to earlier, across to other religious groups, in the one hand to Christians, but also to go back to earlier Islamic tradition to see how these older traditions are actually being reinvented or being changed in the contemporary traditions as such. So religion, the future of religion seems to be much more important in the public sphere than the future of political values or social values as such. And then finally, as far as the actors are concerned, as I mentioned to you in the beginning, that it was expected that the Muslim publics would be promoted, would be driven by new actors, by people who are trained in the sciences, by people who are trained at the universities as such. And it was expected that religious leaders would have less of a role. What we found invariably across in different Muslim societies in Africa is in fact that religious leaders who may have been marginalized at one time have actually reorganized themselves and taken advantage of the new kinds of technologies that are available in order to reassert their authority. So perhaps what you are seeing in the Muslim publics is the emergence of new religious leaders, not in the sense that they are perhaps more liberal religious leaders or liberal religions as such, but they are religious leaders